Hello, Tennessee Voices viewers and listeners. This is David Plazas, the Opinion and Engagement Director for the USA Today Network Tennessee and the Tennessean. Today, I have the pleasure of having as my guest, Phil Cobucci, who is the founder and board president of Inclusion Tennessee. Phil, how are you doing today?
Great, David. How are you?
Doing very well, thank you. And for people who are not familiar with Inclusion Tennessee, tell us a little bit about it.
We are a brand new organization that has been in development and in research for the last 3.5 years, right through the pandemic. We debuted about 3.5 weeks ago at this point. And our goal and our mission is to connect people and opportunities and resources to enrich and enhance the multifaceted LGBTQIA plus community throughout Middle Tennessee and eventually Tennessee.
Excellent. And you just recently wrote a guest opinion column for the Tennessean. Thank you so much about that. And they were very powerful words. The headline was How Inclusion Tennessee Breaks Down Isolation and Creates Civic Participation. And those are two themes that you bring up a lot: isolation, civic participation. Could you talk a little bit about how that basically goes into the work that you've been doing all this time?
Sure. So the Inclusion Tennessee was really founded on this idea and this study that was done on the LGBTQ plus community back in 2019. And what we found in that research throughout Middle Tennessee was that there was a real lack of connection. We found that people in our community did not have the opportunity to be connected to one another in a really authentic way. We also found that there was a lack of belonging, and that there was a lack of authentic relationships that were being, a lack of authentic relationship that was being built between one another. And this ranged in ages all the way from 18 to 26, all the way to 50 plus. And so when we were doing our work in sort of the research phase and the behind the scenes work, what we found was that we needed to create programming that was more safe, not associated with nightlife, and programming that was specifically focused on creating community that was collaborative, community that was focused on celebrating the whole person, and not necessarily focused on just one side of a specific identity.
It was really interesting. We saw each other at the Nashville Pride event recently. And one of the things I found was I was looking at all the booths, and it was a mix of organizations, whether it was issues related to religion or sobriety or issues related to politics and organizing. And so it basically showed a very multifaceted part of the community. And when people ask you about the LGBTQ community in Nashville, what do you like to say?
Well, I'd like to say that we are a vibrant community, right? And that we are multifaceted, because there is a unique, we are a unique community. There is so much that is special about our community. But the one thing that I think is easily identifiable is that there is a real lack of a home base. There's a lack of, there's not a place for all of us to be in one space at one time together to celebrate our identities. And so that's what we're looking to create and create that connection through Inclusion Tennessee, while also identifying and creating programming where there's those lacks of connection that exist.
I often think about when I've done my travels recently to community centers in Chicago and Halstead or in Philadelphia in the downtown area or Montreal. And what would be your vision for what that looks like, that space of connection?
It's funny that you say Center on Halstead in Chicago, because that's one of the centers that we are mirroring. And I would say I and members of my board, we have all traveled around the country, and we have studied different centers, whether it be through in-person visits or conversations via Zoom during the pandemic. And I think that when we're looking at centers, San Diego Center comes to mind, the Center on Halstead in Chicago, the Montrose Center in Houston, the center in Fort Lauderdale, are all really these centers that have done amazing work over many, many years, that all have qualities that we can bring to Nashville with a very easy lift.
It can be a challenge, I think, in a place like Tennessee, where there's been a whole spate of anti-LGBTQ legislation that's been passed over the years. And how has that affected the sense of community that you see here in people's attitudes toward living in Nashville and Tennessee as a whole?
I'm going to be honest with you, David, and this might not be the most popular answer, but I think there's a split right down the middle. I think you have some people in our community who will fight all day long and will say that we need to resist and we need to fight for everyone in our community. And then there are people in our community who are just like, okay, and they don't band together. And what needs to happen is that we all need to come together and we all need to stand up for one another, because the way I look at it is that if one LGBTQ person is left behind or is hurting, then we all hurt. And we have to create those opportunities for every single one of us to move forward together. Otherwise, we're all going to be left behind.
Yeah, you make me think about the first part of your op-ed, which you start with listening as an act of love, and you go on to quote Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Nobel laureate, where he says there comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. What inspired you to write the piece the way you did?
That's a good question. I will tell you that my work really started, my path was made clear, I would say, after a really horrible, no good, very bad series of events that happened in my own life. 2019, I did this research project with Nashville Pride. I was really hopeful that this was going to be we're going to do this project and it's going to be great and we're going to learn a lot of things and someone's going to take the mantle and do something with it. And then COVID happened, and then a tornado happened, and a series of really unfortunate events in my own life happened. And what that caused was this opportunity for my path to be made clear in a way that I never really anticipated. And truthfully, no one would ever anticipate their life completely crumbling beneath them. You know, I lost my house in the tornado. My business, I owned a marketing agency for many years here in Nashville, basically crumbled beneath my feet. And I lost a lot. And my path was just literally my path was made clear to the point where I said, okay, well, I have this body of work. I've heard all these stories. My heart has been broken to pieces by all of these stories that I've heard from all of this research that I've done over 2019. What am I going to do with it? This is the opportunity for me to create the change. And as part of my healing, as part of my own therapy of getting through the traumatic events that I experienced in 2020, therapy obviously assigns you a lot of reading to do. And so one of those books, that quote was in it. And it was the aha for me. At that very moment, it was the thing that clicked on and said, okay, Phil, your path is clear. Do this. It's your time. And so I started writing. And that was February of 2021. And I started writing a business plan. And in a matter of 3 months, I had a board. And Inclusion Tennessee was born into something that I never anticipated. So
That's so powerful. Thank you so much for sharing that. That in the midst of adversity, you found a path forward and ahead, and that's very difficult. And we're at the midpoint of the discussion where I always like to ask guests what they've been doing to cope through the era of COVID. But obviously, you've shared a little bit about some of the things. And I think, could we go a little bit further into the fact is, how have you turned tragedy into resilience?
That's a good one. I have literally in front of me a stack of probably 250 books of different self-help, spirituality, every kind of book that you could imagine that has kind of guided me through this process of healing. And it's really, I would say that has been my process. It has been my process of going through not only dealing with the most current traumas and pain, but also dealing with the horrible stuff that has happened in my 39 years of existence. And I think one of the things that we learn about our existence, especially when you're going through the horrible parts of life, or your trauma, right, is that the traumatic things that have happened to you in the past that you may not have necessarily dealt with are the things that have also come flying forward, right? I use this analogy quite a bit. It's like you're driving a bus of life, right? And when the traumatic event in life happens and you slam into that wall, all of the stuff that you've thrown to the back of the bus your entire life comes flying forward, right? So not only are you dealing with the traumatic event that you just drove into the wall over, but now you have all of the stuff that you haven't dealt with in your life sitting in the back, sitting in the front of your bus. So now you have two sets of trauma that you have to deal with and navigate. And so for me, it was a lot of this, like, okay, I have a house that I lost in a tornado. I have a business that has been decimated. I have past trauma in my life that I have to navigate. And I will tell you that over all of that time, especially during COVID, I spent a lot of time reading, I spent a lot of time writing, started writing my story, because one of the, it's a healing practice. And as you go through those healing practices, you quickly identify your values, you quickly identify what you are focused on and who you're going to, how you're going to come out of the horrible, no good, very bad, to create the change that you desperately want to see for yourself and for other people in the world. So.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Very, very powerful words. And I think it's a lesson that so many of us who have gone through traumas, both big and small, can learn from. And you talk a lot about in your op-ed and also in your remarks about connections and meaningful connections. What are some of the ways that you're doing that and that you aspire to do that?
I think connection is a really deep and important way to build community, right? And so connection can be everything from doing in-person events, as it's safe to do so in still a pandemic era, but it's also finding ways to create community digitally. Now, I do not believe personally that we can make community digitally. And this is coming from someone who built an entire career in the digital marketing sphere, right? I do not believe that we can build one-on-one relationships with people through a digital computer screen, right? But what I do believe is that we can build personal one-on-one relationships in unique and memorable ways that foster a sense of trust, that foster a sense of peace, that foster a sense of awakening, and do so in a way that is creates a sense of this like magic, right? That can further change our culture and our communities. And we can do that only if we walk hand in hand together.
Chance to moderate an event for National Public Television a few weeks ago, and had to do with aging. This is one aspect that doesn't often get covered too much in popular media about the LGBTQ community and the needs for aging people, whether it's social support or whether it's still dealing with issues of bigotry. And I'd love to learn more about those conversations and how they might have been different or similar to some of the conversations to younger people you had.
Yeah. Those conversations broke my heart, I'll be honest. and still thinking back to them 3 years later, they're hard to even speak to. You would hear some of the people in these conversations and they would talk about all of their friends dying, and they would talk about their partners just withering away from HIV and AIDS. And I don't think that we as a LGBT community truly understand what our Stonewall era went through some days. And to this day, I still don't fully understand that because I never lived through it. But there's so much that we can learn from our history. There's an Instagram account that I'm sure many people have heard about or hopefully have at least heard of. And the hashtag that they use is what's what's remembered lives. And it talks about people who died during the AIDS crisis, and it talks about their stories, and it tells their stories. And it's one of the most beautiful Instagram accounts, in my opinion, because it just tells the story of a new person every single day, right? And when you have thousands upon thousands of people who have lost their lives, and you have thousands and thousands of people who've been left behind, there's a lot to sit with. From our current state of affairs, I can tell you that there's so many people in our community who are not prepared, right? They're aging. They are not ready for what the next phase of life is. They don't have they don't have the tools or the resources. They don't have the programming. They're scared, or they're just trying to avoid that conversation right now because it's not the easiest conversation to have. And so one of our biggest priorities with our organization is that we are going to be partnering with not only 50 Forward, but other organizations in this city, in this region, to help provide those wraparound services and those end-of-life planning mechanisms and all the necessary steps, healthcare, et cetera, to ensure that our older adults, our Stonewall era, truly have the care that they need every step of the way. Because the one thing you have to think about too, David, is that if these folks do not have a loved one, or they don't have family, or they've been disowned by their family, or they've been disconnected from family, or whatever it might be, or they don't have kids, that there's nobody there to take care of them, right? And it's incumbent upon us, the younger adults in our community, to care for them. And we have to provide them with those services and resources in order to ensure that they can live in the latter parts of their lives.
Thank you for sharing that. I'd also mentioned younger people as well. I know early on in the conversation, you talked about the non-nightlife aspect of Inclusion Tennessee, and there are obviously nightlife places in town. But what do young people say their needs are and their goals for connection are?
Interesting. I think you briefly touched on nightlife, right? And nightlife does play an important role in our culture, right? I think that's one thing that has to be said full stop. But there are people in our community who do not want to be part of nightlife culture, and that's fine. We have to be able to provide them with a coffee shop that's open late, where they can have book clubs, or they can have safe and sober spaces to gather. That's maybe not so loud. We have a huge neurodivergent community. We have disability focused communities as well that we need to be focused on and celebrating and honoring. Those people need places to gather and to be as well. But not everybody needs a nightlife spot every single night of the week. Some people just want a safe place to be, full stop, period. And it may not necessarily be a coffee shop, right? That is corporate run, but that is a queer operated coffee shop or a safe space that is marketed as such. Those are things that are needed in our community, and that's what people that are younger are saying that they need. They're also wanting bookstores and retail stores that speak to their lived experience. They're wanting places to just hang out. They're wanting performing art spaces. They're wanting art galleries. It runs the gamut. It's incredible. And one of the things that we are doing right now, and I'll quickly say that we are working with the Nashville Civic Design Center currently through the summer. And we're working with them to identify specifically what our community wants in a space. And I think that's the most critical piece, because things have changed drastically, obviously, in 3 years since the community visioning project. And so that work will help us cultivate down a little bit more as to what specifically is needed in a community space that is built for our community here in Nashville.
Thank you so much. And if people want to learn more, I believe they can go to inclusiontn.org. Is that right?
That's correct.
Well, I want to thank you so much. Phil Cobucci is the founder and board president of Inclusion Tennessee, a new organization. I have appreciated this conversation very much and our discussion. I wish you the best success in your endeavors. Before I let you go, I always like to ask guests if they leave some words of wisdom with our audience to help us get through this challenging time.
2, I always ask this question, and so the first question I asked myself when I started writing my business plan for Inclusion TN. What would you do if you knew you could not fail? Full stop. And then secondly, too often we underestimate the power of a touch, a smile, a kind word, a listening ear, an honest compliment, or the smallest act of caring, all of which have the potential to turn a life around.
Thank you so much, Phil. May you stay well and healthy. And again, I'm so grateful for you joining me on today's episode of the Tennessee Voices video podcast.
Thank you, David.